Opening the center immediately invites a dynamic struggle for central control and piece development. Replicating the central pawn offers immediate tactical clarity and a shared fight for the board's core. Instantly challenging black's central pawn and preparing to castle, this knight leap ignites the early tactical landscape. Developing a piece that controls central squares and adds defending power is a classic sound response. This probing bishop immediately challenges black's knight, hinting at a subtle gambit for initiative. Aggressively challenging white's bishop, this develops a piece and prepares kingside castling by freeing the king's diagonal. Securing the king's safety now allows for freer piece development and potential kingside attacks. Boldly challenging white's central pawn structure, black immediately opens tactical possibilities, sacrificing pawn for initiative. Opening the center forcefully challenges black's advanced knight, aiming to seize the initiative and create attacking chances. Retrieving the knight to a less active square relinquishes central control and creates a lingering target. Trading off black's knight opens a diagonal for your bishop and disrupts their pawn structure, creating endgame advantages. Accepting the doubled pawns might seem like a concession, but it opens a diagonal for your queen and prepares for eventual central pawn breaks. Clearing the d-file now opens avenues for your pieces, creating dynamic imbalances. The knight's journey to f5 aims to recapture the pawn and bolster black's central presence. Forcing the queen trade simplifies into an endgame where white's central pawn majority will be a significant advantage. Relinquishing castling rights for pawn structure control is a classic trade-off. Now focus on developing your remaining pieces harmoniously. Developing the knight to c3 prepares for further piece activity and challenges black's knight without disrupting white's king's safety. Relocating the king to safety, but it remains exposed on this open central file. Solidifying your queenside and preparing to reroute the knight towards the center offers a practical approach. Initiating a flank pawn storm might seem aggressive, but it ignores crucial central development and leaves your monarch dangerously exposed. Shifting the knight to the kingside now aims to support the central pawn push, potentially unblocking the bishop. Developing the bishop to e7 prepares to castle and reinforces the pawn structure on the queenside. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating an immediate imbalance and probing for weaknesses in black's slightly compromised pawn structure. Pushing the h-pawn creates a dynamic imbalance, potentially overextending on the queenside while opening avenues for piece activity. Defending the g4 square preemptively, this move offers a modest, defensive posture against black's advancing pawn structure. Developing the bishop to a more active square, this move looks to support the pawn push and potentially challenge white's central control. Solidifying central space and preparing for queenside expansion, this move initiates a strategic pawn storm aimed at disrupting black's kingside shelter. Centralizing the rook creates an immediate threat, contesting the d-file and preparing for potential piece exchanges that could ease black's development. Centralizing the rook on the open d-file finally activates this piece, bolstering white's influence over the crucial central avenue and preparing for potential endgame advantages. Forcing a piece exchange simplifies the position, clearing the d-file and potentially creating endgame opportunities. Opening the d-file now allows your rook to dominate, forcing black's king deeper into the cramped center. Simplifying the position by trading pieces, black opens lines for their remaining minor pieces and prepares to activate the rook on the d-file. Reclaiming the knight solidifies central control and prepares for queenless middle game operations. Activating the rook on the semi-open file, aiming for a more centralized position and potential endgame pressure. Retreating the knight to its initial square might seem passive, but it cleverly unblocks the c3 pawn for potential queenside expansion and frees the f3 square for future knight maneuvers. The king abandons its central post, seeking refuge on the flank, but this repositioning might expose it to further pressure. Shifting the knight to the kingside aims to bolster kingside defense and potentially launch a counterattack, stabilizing the pawn structure. seeking a safer haven for the queen, aiming to regroup and consolidate the rook's influence. Stepping the knight forward reasserts pressure, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch by preparing for a potential kingside attack. Recentralizing the rook to eye the d-file and prepare potential pawn advances looks sensible, seeking better coordination. Opening the center dramatically, this exchange aims to simplify into a favorable pawn structure for white, potentially exploiting black's isolated pawns. Opening the f-file decisively shapes the ensuing endgame, challenging black's doubled pawns. Centralizing the monarch offers a safer haven amidst this maneuvering skirmish. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move aims to deny white's knight any entry and prepares for better piece placement on the queenside. Centralizing the king offers a vital escape square and supports potential pawn pushes. Establishing space on the queenside with this pawn advance might offer better piece mobility later. Shifting the monarch to a more active square, aiming to support the queenside pawns and potentially prepare a kingside pawn push. Carving out queenside space, this pawn push now demands an immediate white response. Relocating the king to the king's flank, despite the pawn structure being compromised, seeks to activate it and potentially shelter it from further advances on the queenside. Opening the queenside pawns, this aims to activate the rook and disrupt white's queenside structure. Cracking open the queenside now, white gains vital space and prepares for the incoming pawn storm. Exploring open files, this rook aims to pressure white's weakened queenside pawn structure. Striking the king with the knight forces a concession and opens the kingside further. Securing the king's relocation is paramount given the open files and potential threats from those active knights. Capturing the pawn on h4 might seem tempting, but it offers black a crucial tempo to develop their pieces and potentially launch an attack. Pivoting the knight to a central outpost offers tactical and positional pressure, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and outposts. Securing the rook on the open file allows white to organize its forces for an endgame push. Asserting dominion over the open file with the rook, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn surge, white aims to break open lines and exploit black's exposed kingside. The rook boldly probes the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawns and establish a more active presence. A bold king march, seeking sanctuary amidst the battlefield chaos. The king embarks on a daring journey, seeking sanctuary amidst the chaos. Asserting control over the open file immediately prepares a decisive pawn push. A desperate attempt to reignite activity, but the king remains exposed to the open lines. Aggressively advancing the king into enemy territory, embracing significant king exposure for potential tactical gains, or to force the opponent into difficult choices. The knight lands on a potentially dangerous outpost, eyeing important central squares. Finally removing the bothersome knight, white initiates a decisive capture that opens the f-file for a promising attack. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical diagonal, exposing the white king to immediate threats. The king's exposed position invites decisive harassment from the rook and knight duo. A bold pawn push now creates attacking chances on the kingside, but risks weakening the pawn structure. Opening the a-file immediately pressures black's unstable king position. Gambling with the king's safety to create counterplay, but it exposes your king further. Capturing the pawn opens the f-file for an aggressive pawn push and potentially exposes black's king to further threats. Unleashing the pawn storm now, creating a dangerous vanguard to disrupt the white king's safety and secure a breakthrough. Unleashing the rook along the open file aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Unleashing the passed pawn's fury to break through the white king's defenses. Sacrificing the rook opens lines, but leaves the king exposed to the relentless pawn push. The black king's exposed position after this step invites further tactical engagement, demanding vigilance. Unleashing a decisive check, white targets the weakened black king's escape squares and prepares to reclaim material. Capturing the pawn solidifies the queen's file control, but opens up the black king's escape routes. Unleashing a swift attack, white targets the open files and aims to exploit black's exposed monarch. Unleashing the rook's power on the 7th rank finally grants black initiative, forcing white to defend his exposed king. The king's exposed position becomes a critical weakness as white seeks active counterplay. The pawn's advance is a bold gambit, sacrificing itself to create a dangerous passed threat that black must immediately address. Protecting the pawn's structure becomes paramount, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Unleashing a final pawn push, black aims to corner the enemy monarch with surprising swiftness. Opening a clear path for your rook and activating the pawn for a decisive push. Hoping to create a mating net with the rook on the 3rd rank, but the king is escaping the immediate danger, and the black rook can now become very active. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical path to expose the enemy king and initiate a mating attack. Sacrificing the king like this opens up decisive tactical lines for white to exploit, aiming to trap the black king. Unleash your rook. The open files now favor a decisive queenside assault. The black king, exposed and alone, faces a devastating discovered check with the pawn push. Unlocking the 7th rank's power with this pawn advance is key to pressing the advantage. The black king is now exposed, a prime target as the white pawn races to queen. Propelling the pawn forward to escort the passed king's pawn signifies the ultimate rush for decisive victory. The black king ventures too close to enemy territory, inviting decisive action. Unleash the king from its gilded cage to hunt the exposed black monarch. Seizing the exposed pawn is a critical step in the endgame struggle, aiming to consolidate gains before the king is put in danger. The pawn's coronation on the queen side seals the deal, activating the new queen to hunt down black's weakened king. The pawn promotion transforms the board, leaving black's king exposed to overwhelming mating threats. Unveiling the promoted queen, a new endgame challenge begins.